Hi, I'm Preet, senior C Everett student, occasional B.
I'm Harris Gagnon, and this is our agricultural video for the AP Huge final project. Before agriculture started, food was obtained by hunting, fishing, or gathering in small groups of usually 50 or fewer people.
We know now that hunting and gathering is the first form of getting, food, and along this time a division of labor occurred where men would hunt and fish while women would collect nuts.
Today, only 250,000 people, or less than 0.005% of the world, survive by hunting and gathering.
An example of these hunters and gatherers in the modern world are the Bushmen of Africa who hunt in deserts and gather their food through this substance.
The first agricultural hearth we're going to talk about is Southwest Asia, where the earliest crops were barley and wheat about 10,000 years ago.
The next hearth to follow suit was East Asia with its production of the rice crop 10,000 years ago as well.
Up next is Africa, where their earliest crops were yams or sorghum about 8,000 years ago.
The last hearth we're going to talk about is Latin America, where in Mexico they had found beans and cotton, and Peru had found potatoes, where corn was a major crop around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago.
So as part of the invention of agriculture, they had to domesticate animals, and the first part we're going to talk about is Southwest Asia, where they domesticated cattle, goats, pigs, and sheep about 8 to 9,000 years ago, and they domesticated the dog about 12,000 years ago.
After Southwest Asia had domesticated this many animals, Central Asia had closely followed suit with this domestication of the horse.
So why did agriculture come about? Well, for two reasons. One, environmental factors. After the last ice age, it caused people, plants, and animals to relocate to new areas of the world.
There were also cultural factors involved with this decision making. Preferences of a fixed place for living were different among these tribes.
Another two reasons for agriculture was due to accident and experimentally. So people would accidentally drop seeds from foods or plants, and they would end up growing. And experimentally, people would purposely drop those seeds to see what would happen and if anything would grow, and it eventually led to agriculture.
After the development of agriculture, this led to two different forms. Subsistence, the older one, where you're farming mainly to feed you and your family, which is more common in LDCs, also known as less developed countries. And commercial, which is a newer one, where you sell foods to gain a profit. Mostly these are in more developed countries like America.
Another way that subsistence and commercial agriculture differ is the use of machinery. The subsistence agriculture, mostly in LDCs, use tools and animals, but commercial agriculture rely on machines to make the food.
After the development of commercial agriculture, this slowly led to the development of agribusiness, which is the process of a company owning the entire food process.
With differences in types of farming comes different types of diets. Diets depend on the level of development, physical conditions, and the culture of the people who are on the farm.
Along with different diets, we see different nutrients as well. Like in MDCs, most of the protein comes from meat, while LDC has to gain their protein from grain due to being less developed and having less resources.
This chart here shows the undernourishment in the world, which is 99% in less developed countries, and about 850 million people in the world are undernourished.
Now we will start discussing types of agriculture. For example, one of the types of agriculture is pastoral nomadization. This is a form of subsistence agriculture, meaning it is grown for not to gain money or monetary value, but rather for to feed a family. So it takes up 20% of the world's land, and it's mostly in LDCs, and it relies on domestication and herding animals.
The next type of agriculture is shifting cultivation, which is also mostly in less developed countries, and it's known as slash and burn agriculture because the farmers clear the land by slashing the vegetation and burning the debris, and then they grow the crops on the cleared field for a few years until the soil gets depleted, and then they leave it fallow for many years until the soil can recover. This takes up about one-fourth of the world's area, and only 5% of the people in the world practice it.
The next type of agriculture we're going to talk about is intensive subsistence agriculture. Where is it? Oh, and it's mostly in LDCs, and it feeds about three-fourths of the world's population, and it's usually wet rice. So the wet rice you're eating is due to intensive subsistence agriculture.
This type of agriculture uses almost all the land and is done where there's plenty of monsoons, which is in most parts of Asia.
The next type of agriculture, or rather subtype of agriculture, we'll be talking about is intensive subsistence without rice. This is practiced in all the other parts of Asia and uses grain crops.
The last type of agriculture in less developed countries is plantations, except plantations are a little different because MDCs are also involved. The LDCs are where the plantations are and where they grow the crops, but the area and land is usually owned by someone in a more developed country who uses the crops for uh, the ability to sell, and it usually focuses on only one or two crops.
The next type of agriculture we'll be talking about is mixed crop and livestock. These are MDCs and are used to grow crops to feed animals, and they sell the animal products like the beef and the lard maybe. And this uses crop rotation as a major factor.
The next type of agriculture is dairy farming, which is usually in more developed countries, and they have to locate close to big cities so the milk doesn't spoil. This is called the milk shed, which is the ring around a city where the milk can be supplied before it goes bad. This is very labor intensive, and the cows must be fed in the winter, which is called winter feed, which is a con to this kind of agriculture.
Another type of agriculture we're going to talk about is gardening and fruit farming. These are in most more developed countries like the U.S. This is mostly readily found in the southeast part of the U.S. This is also known as truck farming and as hire migrant work for laborers and low cost. This also specializes with crops, so they don't use all the crops they can.
The next type of agriculture is grain farming, which is mostly in more developed countries, and the crops are grown to eat, whereas in mixed crop and livestock, they're grown to feed the animals. Now, wheat is the most traded crop in the world and the most exported, and it uses machinery and is done on very large farms where they sell their products. Uh, they also try to fit the consumer preferences so they make the most money.
The next type of agriculture is Mediterranean. These are this is often grown in MDCs and sometimes LDCs. These usually border the sea, and crops are grown to eat. They have a lot of olives and grapes, which are the most important, and horticulture, where you grow fruit and flower and trees, as well as vegetables.
The next type of agriculture is livestock ranching, which is the grazing of livestock over land. This is usually done where the soil is poor and in more dry type areas. It was in the U.S. Midwest, but they moved north for better circumstances.
Now we're going to talk about what farmers and LDCs how they face challenges. Well, subsistence farmers they have to grow food for export rather than consumption because of the international trade approach for development. And consumers in developed countries are willing to pay higher prices for fruits and vegetables that are local.
Challenges for farmers in MDCs are different than those in LDCs. There is a big overproduction in commercial farming, which creates surpluses, so those farmers end up suffering from low income because they produce so much food that it's not all demanded for consumers. And U.S. government policies are also impacting these farmers because they're encouraged to avoid producing crops that will create a surplus, and the government pays farms when certain commodity prices are low, and the government will buy those surpluses to sell to other foreign governments who need that food.
So, what is the von Thunen model? Well, von Thunen model is a tool that geographers use to explain the importance of market and how close the crops need to be. So, the first ring is the highly perishable food like milk. things that can go bad and expire.
The second ring are items that are more difficult to transport, so they have to be closer towards the market. An example of this would be wood, because of the weight of the wood. It is a bulk gaining process, so it has to locate close to the markets.
Zone 3 is almost like a junk zone. Like, it has a mixture of certain crops and pasture lands that don't really fit into zone 1 or 2 or 4.
The last ring is the fourth ring, which is for animal grazing, because there's a lot of land, and types of farming that would use this would be ranching or possibly mixed crop and livestock. Things that von Thunen and his model didn't consider was the site, human factors, cultural customs, and government policies. These can all cause the rings to change shape and possibly change where they are.
Now, I know we've been fairly critical of how we don't have that much food left, but here's some ways to increase the world's food supply. One would be exporting from other countries with surpluses, which currently is in effect from the U.S. Two would be expanding the land and area used for agriculture. Three would be expanding fisheries and fishing. And four would be increasing productivity and lands used for agriculture.
Expanding on agricultural land and how we could increase that to increase the world's food supply, it's tough to do that, and a few scientists think we can no longer do that due to desertification, which is where the land becomes like a desert because there's no water and so much erosion has occurred that it's impossible for that land to become inhabitable by humans.
Signing off, this has been Hinju Productions.